Okay, hello everyone. My name is Jessica Smith. I'm a consultant to the CBD Secretariat along with Jamie Webb and Veronica Lowe. We have been supporting the CBD Secretariat in the past months in delivering a number of innovative remote capacity building exercises around Aichi targets 14 and 15 and through the programs of work on climate change and dry and subhumid lands biodiversity. And today we welcome Dr. Joseph Bull from Imperial College London to speak to us about conservation when nothing stands still. Joe is not only a visiting researcher at Imperial College London, but he's also director of a consultancy company, Wild Business, and a technical advisor on biodiversity mainstreaming in Uzbekistan to UNDP. So we've asked Dr. Bull to speak to us on this topic, of which there was a paper circulated with the announcement from the CBD Secretariat. The relevance of drylands to this topic will be pulled out through the slides that Joe will proceed through. Given that we will have a number of attendees to the webinar, we're going to ask that we, first of all, keep everyone on mute so that we don't have any background noise during the call. And also that we take all questions at the end of the presentation. But in the interim, if there's any points to raise, please feel free to go to the right hand of your screen and use the chat feature. So I will hand over to Joe now. I hope that's clear with everyone. And I'm guessing that we'll have some other participants join as the presentation's getting started, but we will be also recording the presentation in case there's anyone who misses part of the session or wasn't able to attend today. So I hope that's everything now. Joe, I'm handing over to you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jessica. So now, hopefully my screen should be the one that everyone can see. Jessica, can I just confirm with you that that's fine and that's working okay? Okay, I will continue, so please just interrupt if there's any technical problems.
Okay.
Yes, is that okay? Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me along to give this webinar. I'm very pleased to do so. Thanks to Jessica for organising it, and thank you to CBD for hosting and for the support from the Japan Biodiversity Fund. As Jessica said, I'm going to talk today about conservation when nothing stands still, and to give a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about, if my slide will go along. After a quick introduction, I'm going to talk about this concept of moving conservation targets and what it is that I and my co-authors meant by that. I'm going to talk about some of what we call dynamic conservation solutions that exist out there, and then that's going to take us on to a discussion around biodiversity offsets, which is one of the main components of the talk today. After that, I'm just going to go through a few kind of general challenges that are involved in moving conservation targets and then using biodiversity offsets to do so, before going into two case studies. Now, as Jessica mentioned, these two case studies are both drylands. One is a region which I've done a lot of work in, partly through my work for the UNDP, which is in Uzbekistan, and concerns the Saiga antelope. And the second is linked and actually sprung from this paper that I'm going to talk about, which is conservation of the Letter Prairie chicken in the US. And finally, I'm going to finish with some conclusions. And just to emphasize again that you've all been sent the paper, I understand, but this is generally, unless I specify otherwise, based upon research published in that paper. So, a key challenge, and we highlight this, is that in contemporary conservation is to consider moving conservation targets. And to put that simply, just the fact we need to consider the fact that nature doesn't stand still. A lot of our modern conservation or contemporary conservation measures are based on static interventions, and a good example of that is the use of fixed protected areas. But what we found from a review of the literature is that people increasingly realize that these aren't always effective in a dynamic and changing world. As such, various authors in various parts of the world have proposed more dynamic approaches to conservation, more dynamic interventions. But the vast majority of these are currently still theoretical and have not been tested widely in practice. So really, one of the key points of our of our paper and of what I'm going to talk about in the talk today is that we propose biodiversity offsetting as one potential mechanism for doing so. So just a note, and thanks Jessica for providing this information, but a note to the relevance of drylands biodiversity. First, just to specify that the research that I've done and my co-authors have done on offsets is general, involves general principles that apply to all habitats, but it just so happens that a lot of the research has been focused around dryland case studies, but they are general findings and general points. But as I said, the two case studies are for drylands, and obviously drylands are an important habitat, which we and just that's really just to pull that out here, kind of enormous percentage of the Earth's terrestrial surface that they cover, and the number of the 2 billion people that represent. There's also been a lot of there's been 1 or 2 points in the literature recently where it's been pointed out that drylands are underrepresented in protected area networks, given their importance and also given their percentage coverage of the land surface. They're also host to a wide array of biodiversity, which is very important, and we'll talk about a couple of those species today. This often endemic species and often highly mobile, and that's partly as a result to adaptation to dryland conditions, which involve low rainfall and therefore and large open landscapes, which are kind of have species being driven around by patterns of precipitation and climate change and so forth. So what exactly do we mean by moving conservation targets? The 2 examples that really I focused on in my research. The first is migratory species or highly nomadic species, and there's a picture on the right there of the Saiga antelope. I'm not sure how many people here will be familiar with that species, but it's a small ungulate that inhabits Central Asia and parts of Russia. And they're a moving target because obviously migratory species can move over very large distances and through numbers of jurisdictions and through different habitats and climatic regions. Alternatively, another example which I've explored a lot in my research is habitats that are subject to environmental change. So rather than a regularly fluctuating target, such as a migratory species which moves back and forth in a relatively predictable pattern, we also have all habitats really are subject to environmental change, such as climate change, which is much more open-ended movement, and means that if, for instance, vegetation is being driven by changing temperatures or changing rainfall patterns over time, we know that it's not going to stay still as a habitat for a conservation intervention. So we need to account for that in the design of our interventions. But these are just 2 examples which I'll focus on today. In reality, all biodiversity is mobile on some scale of time or space. So if you look over a large enough time scale, of course, everything is mobile. And I think contemporary conservation is starting to really realize this and design this into conservation interventions. Just to highlight, now again, I thank Jessica for putting this information in, but to highlight the relevance that IHE targets of biodiversity offsetting and of considering moving conservation targets. So in reality, obviously, it's as I've pointed out, that moving conservation targets are all targets in the end of the day, and so they're relevant for all the IHE targets. But the few that are highlighted in blue here are particularly relevant. So for instance, in creating protected areas, for instance, target 11 is obviously highly relevant in terms of the percentage of land and water that comes under protection and how we design those protected area networks. Equally, if part of the goal is to safeguard ecosystem services, for instance, then target 14 is particularly relevant, and that's something that's coming increasingly into consideration when we're designing dynamic conservation interventions and considering moving targets. So these are just a few to start bringing us kind of closer towards the case studies. Without going too much into detail now, these are to highlight how dynamic systems can be if we're trying to implement conservation measures. So on the left there is, and I'll come on to this a bit later in the talk, but is our case study of Northwest Uzbekistan. And what we have there is a kind of spatial map that shows trends in vegetation indices over time, over the last 10 or 12 years. The scale on the right shows the difference per pixel in vegetation index, basically. So where it's red, there's been a trend for decrease in vegetation cover, and where it's green, it's been an increase. So you can see that landscape over a period of 10 or 12 years, and that we know that that's been repeated for previous decades as well, has seen an increasingly arid trend, and lost green vegetation mass and so forth. So that's when I talk about habitats that are moving targets, that's kind of what I mean. We need to consider the fact that because of global climate change, this is, or local climate change, but also global climate change, habitats such as this in northwest Uzbekistan are undergoing relatively dramatic change. On the right there, we have a plot of Saiga antelope abundance in that same region that's captured in that map there. And that basically shows the catastrophic decline in the Saiga antelope over the last few decades. And so that's really to highlight that a migratory species. The Saiga are highly migratory. They move back and forth between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, or this population do every year. And to show that they are a serious conservation priority in the region because of that dramatic decline. But they're also, the fact that they're highly migratory means that they're hard to really capture with standard, protected areas. So how do we look to more dynamic conservation solutions? Well, to pick out some of those that have been proposed in the literature, and as I said, a lot of these are in theory rather than in practice, or tested in practice so far, that seem like a good idea in theory. The first is actually to use fixed protected areas in some cases. So if a sufficient part of a species range can be captured by a fixed static protected area, or if the more sensitive parts of that species life cycle can be captured by that fixed protected area, then that can work. But that requires an understanding of the degree to which that species is mobile and where that species goes and how it life cycle works, in order to demonstrate that is an effective solution. Alternatively, there have been calls for mobile protected areas, and these would follow the species across the landscape. They might follow a species kind of on an annual cycle, follow the migration, or more realistically, they might follow certain parts of that species life cycle as it changes with time. So to continue with the example of the Saiga antelope, the highly sensitive time in that species life cycle is calving, and they calve in fixed locations, but that location is moving through time as a result of human disturbance and other factors. So if a protected area was created to capture the species calving areas, that might move across the landscape over time. And in fact, that has been proposed. And indeed, one of the few examples of the use of a mobile protected area in the past was implemented by the Soviet Union in previous years for that species. An alternative to mobile protected areas would be temporary protected areas, which are active at certain times of year. And that's mainly partly as a control of resources point of view, but also, for instance, if you have a species that's moving in and out of different jurisdictions, then those jurisdictions can take responsibility for the protection of that species at the appropriate times of year. And then we move on into more resilient networks of protected areas. And again, this is coming out of the literature and being proposed largely as a response to issues such as climate change, where a network of protected areas is designed to contain movement corridors and kind of large core areas which provide refuge for species, and so the entire network is designed to be resilient to climate change and other drivers of global change, such as economic development or whatever. Part of the challenge of using more dynamic solutions is not only to actually find ways to design them and make them work in practice and to satisfy issues such as land tenure issues and so forth, which I'll come on to, but also to have accurate ideas about habitat suitability and how that's likely to change over time, and to project how it's going to change over time, and also the use of appropriate counterfactuals. So when I say counterfactuals, for those who aren't familiar with the term, I mean an prediction of various ecological or social trends, and how those would be different in the absence of certain interventions. So this is kind of a relatively emerging concept in biodiversity conservation science, even though it's been something that's been talked about a lot in other areas of science, such as, for instance, climate science. So biodiversity offsets, we feel, present an opportunity to test some of these different measures, such as mobile protected areas or the creation of resilient networks, biodiversity offsets potentially present an opportunity to test them in the field, which is the one problem with them so far. Now, biodiversity offsets, I know, is one of the innovative mechanisms that CBD sees as a way forward for conservation. But I'll just explain briefly what I mean by them to make sure that everyone attending knows what I'm talking about. So this is extracted from a previous paper we did on focusing on biodiversity offsets in theory and practice. And essentially what it's supposed to illustrate is the difference between a biodiversity offset and partial compensation. So in the top left, if we imagine we have an initial level of biodiversity in a region, and we know we're going to remove some of that biodiversity as a result of development, but we also have some kind of some components of biodiversity which we can apply some potential conservation action to. Now, our options in that case are either one, to go down to the bottom left, where we allow the development to occur but take no action, in which case we'd have the business as usual, arguably, scenario, which is when we have a development and a net loss of biodiversity. A second option would be to go to the top right, where we have the development, but we do something such as some kind of passive action, such as protect that biodiversity that exists elsewhere in the region, which would be kind of partial compensation. And the reason I say partial compensation is this is the kind of thing that has been done a lot as a result of environmental impacts assessment, for instance, for mitigation measures, but it's not necessarily measured, it's not necessarily quantified, and it doesn't lead to a no net loss of biodiversity, which is the goal of offsetting. So if we go down to the bottom right-hand corner, if in the situation in which development occurs and biodiversity loss is measured, but then some kind of active management action is implemented in order to protect and increase the value of the biodiversity that exists there already, such as to increase an area of habitat or to extend an area of wetland or whatever it is, then if that can be demonstrated to provide equivalent compensation to the losses from development, then that would, in principle, be a no net loss of biodiversity, and that's the goal of biodiversity offsets. Now, obviously, as some of you may well know, they're highly controversial and not always applied appropriately in practice. So it'd be interesting to see in the discussion whether anyone picks up on that. But that's, in theory, that's how they work. So the relevance of biodiversity offsets for this moving target problem, as we call it, is, well, partly the biodiversity offsets are increasing in popularity and use worldwide. There's at least 40 or 50 kind of places around the world where there's some kind of policy in place, but also lender requirements, such as the IFC lender requirements, result in their use in countries everywhere. But not only that, but the biodiversity offsets, because they explicitly require this no net loss of biodiversity often over a set time period, there's a requirement to actually evaluate losses and gains, and they thus kind of lend themselves towards taking these kind of dynamics into account. Because if you have to demonstrate no net loss of biodiversity, you have to know what biodiversity you would have had in the absence of your conservation measure, which means you need to know the counterfactual. You need to know what would have happened to that habitat or that species if you hadn't done anything, which means you need to consider its dynamics. So as far as we're concerned, that means that because this no net loss requirement or objective of offsets is explicit, it means they present an opportunity to test these kind of dynamic conservation approaches in the field. Now, there's a lot of challenges to doing so, and I've pulled these again out of the paper we wrote, where we talk about them in a lot more detail. And some of the challenges they include that it can't be assumed that fauna will be conserved along with their habitat. So we can try and conserve a habitat, we can try and conserve a faunal species by protecting the habitat it occupies, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the fauna will be conserved. We know that habitat condition might change over time, so it's one of the things we need to build into our offset design. We know that migratory species might change in a number of ways. They might change their preference and start visiting different sites. They might change the pathway or the course of their migration, or even stop their migration entirely. And I won't go through these one after the other, because there's a set of challenges really that we talk about in detail in the paper, and I want to really get onto the case studies. But a few more challenges to make sure that we pull out, and this comes from Jessica's discussion with David from the IUCN, is this point about the limit of land. And in some countries have this as a problem more than others, in that the land available to be taken out of production and put under protection is limited, which challenges the use of conservation mechanisms such as biodiversity offsets. And in fact, I've worked on a couple of projects where we've seen a company has taken out a license to create biodiversity offsets on areas of land as a conservation measure, but that means that other companies then don't have the option to do that. So that starts to create an issue if that limit is reached. And furthermore, as in any case of conservation, we're trying to bring it to scale. There's a number of trade-offs to consider, and land that is put towards conservation obviously starts to then potentially limit the use of that land for food production or other areas of development. So to move on to the case studies, the first case study I'm going to talk about, as I've mentioned, is northwest Uzbekistan. So this map here shows that northwest corner of the country. It's primarily the Ustyurt Plateau, which is about 150 meters above sea level. It's semi-arid, and it has huge oil and gas reserves, particularly natural gas reserves underneath it, which have been extracted in earnest for at least the last 40 years. It also is home to one of the key populations of the Saiga antelope, as well as many other conservation target species, and at the same time is also massively affected by environmental change, primarily as a result of the problems with the Aral Sea. So for those of you not familiar with the Aral Sea crisis, in the top right of that picture there, you can see the remnants of the Aral Sea. It's dried up hugely and dropped massively in extent as a result of the loss of water input, water being diverted for cotton irrigation. The country have a biodiversity offset policy and development, which is partly what I've been advising them on, and the idea is to kind of compensate for any biodiversity losses caused by extraction of natural gas in the region. And partly what the schematic on that map does is show the existing gas infrastructure, kind of gas extraction sites, the main pipelines, roads and railway, and so forth. So what we've done, actually, I'll go back. What we've done in a couple of these papers, and there's another paper by Jones et al., is we've actually used a couple of field survey techniques to measure what we think the impact is of that existing gas infrastructure upon the local fauna and flora, particularly on local flora. And we've kind of calculated the losses of area of Ustyurt habitat or dryland habitat there as a result of that expanding gas infrastructure. And as a result, we know roughly or we can estimate what we think the conservation requirements would be in that region to have full compensation for biodiversity losses. Now, the biodiversity losses are generally, because the species that live there, a lot of them are so highly mobile, and there's such a huge amount of space there, they tend to move away from infrastructure as a result of disturbance. So in many ways don't actually get that severely impacted by the existence of that limited infrastructure in that large open area. But we do see in that areas is large areas of shrubland cleared as a result of the direct footprint of the gas infrastructure. So the idea is to convert those losses, which aren't of high conservation priority, even though they are clearances of that habitat, into and compensate for those losses with some kind of equivalent gain. So the proposal put forward by many of the ecologists, Uzbek ecologists working in the country, who consult with the UNDP as well, is to create protected areas, essentially to protect these more charismatic species which are rapidly disappearing, as I showed in an earlier slide, as a result of completely separate, as a result of drivers that are nothing to do with oil and gas development, really at all. And so here in this figure, we highlight a couple of the kind of more dynamic interventions we might implement. So the main ones really to focus on, you can see that we've proposed a mobile protected area that would follow calving locations as it moves in and around the plateau. So the protected area isn't fixed on the map, but is essentially where the kind of nature protection effort is put into the area that the nature protection effort is funded and put into play. And that will move over time in space. Another option is to implement temporary protected areas, as I said again earlier, and those would be in place at the right time of year. So depending on whether the Saiga antelope are to the north or south of that international border there, between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. And finally, various other options, and one would be I talked about resilient networks, so one would be to create protected areas that target the available movement corridors and make sure there are links between kind of core core areas where the saiga persist. So what you've got there is a good example of how the losses from natural gas infrastructure can be calculated across the landscape and compensated for with dynamic conservation interventions, which we believe kind of would potentially fully compensate for the losses and actually provide a better conservation outcome than would have had otherwise. But they also provide, as I said, this framework for testing these more dynamic solutions to conservation than simply created fixed protected areas in Uzbekistan and the Steppe Plateau. Now, the second case study I'm going to point to now is one that I'm not actually as familiar with because I haven't spent years working on myself, and that is in the US. And what's happened here is actually proposals have been put forward to conserve the lesser prairie chicken, which is based upon the paper, which is really the Moving Conservation Target paper that we put out a year or two ago. So the proposals are, so I've been in touch with the authors of a number of studies into this and the use of these proposals. The proposals have been put forward by the US Fish and Wildlife Service, and the idea is for this species, the lesser prairie chicken, is to use temporary protected areas across a large landscape to conserve them. Now, the LPC, I'll call it, lives in a kind of straight-across ecosystem, moves a lot is driven by environmental change over time, and that's known and that's followed. So the idea is but a lot of the land is loaned. A lot of the land in which they live is privately owned. In fact, 95% of it is privately owned of LPC habitat. So the idea is to use from the impacts elsewhere of development, the compensation provided as a result of those impacts to fund a series of temporary protected areas in which parcels of that land are put under 5 or 10 year contracts where they're put aside for the conservation of the LPC. And then the fact that those are sort of short-term contracts means that they can change and move across the landscape to keep up with the change in the habitat, change in the range of the LPC as it changes as a result of climate drivers. So that's the idea. Now, whether that's an appropriate use of these kind of moving protected areas or temporary protected areas has been challenged in the literature, and I point to this paper especially by Bender and Woodruff, where they challenge the kind of US Fish and Wildlife Service and worry that they treat the lesser prairie chicken as a flow, as a kind of essentially as a service rather than a stock, and worry that whether that's the inappropriate way to look at this particular species. There's a number of reasons why they're concerned that it might not work in this situation using temporary protected areas. Partly they're concerned about insufficient enforcement of those protected areas and conservation of the species within those areas. Partly they're worried about the ecology of the lesser prairie chicken itself, and whether it's going to use new sites because they're demonstrate quite high fidelity to original breeding and nesting sites, and various other concerns as well. Time lags in the restoration of sites to create habitat in response to development. And finally, whether restoration success is guaranteed. So whether the habitat that is restored to provide a moving habitat for the species, for the lesser prairie chicken, is going to succeed in providing habitat of sufficiently good quality. So there are a number of concerns, and actually Bender and Woodruff challenge whether they don't challenge the original ideas, they don't challenge our application of this, the idea of moving protected areas in the case of the saiga antelope. They think it makes sense, but they are worried that some of these issues mean that it might not make sense in terms of the lesser prairie chicken. So it's worth flagging that in taking these two different case studies and showing that there are differences in terms of where you would and would not try and apply this kind of thinking. So to conclude, hopefully I've kind of hit it about the right amount of time, and obviously we've got time for questions and so forth. But to conclude, we believe there's a growing theoretical basis for more kind of dynamic conservation interventions, such as the ones I've discussed, such as moving protected areas. But it is generally they're kind of generally more established in theory, and we really feel they need to be tested in practice to determine how effective they can be. Our contention is that biodiversity offsetting provides one mechanism for doing this, for testing them in practice, and providing the framework and the funding for doing so. And as far as we are concerned from the literature and from our experience in some of these different case studies, in some situations, such as the Uzbek case, we feel a stronger argument can be made for attempting dynamic conservation than in others, such as the such as the lesser prairie chicken case study. But in any case, in actually making these successful in practice will require a number of things. It will require kind of strong commitment, both from the regulatory body and from the developer. It will require robust enforcement of the principles of conservation intervention. There'll have to be a relatively deep understanding of the uncertainties involved in projecting changes in habitat suitability and changes in species range and so forth, and in projecting change in the environment. And finally, there's various difficulties in terms of how to set up the correct kind of partnerships between different land owners and those with different land rights. And again, that will change based on different countries. I shouldn't have mentioned, for instance, that in Uzbekistan there is no private land ownership. So really, the government has free rein to an extent to create protected areas across a large landscape, whereas obviously in the second case study, as I said, the vast majority is privately owned. So issues such as that kind of need to be taken into deep consideration. However, as a note to finish on, just to say that the key message really is that as again, that all biodiversity is a moving target, really, and we cannot ignore that, especially in a world that's increasingly changing, so changing faster and faster as a result of various drivers. So that's really the take-home message. So thank you very much for listening. I appreciate the time you've given in staying on and listening to my presentation. And I believe Jessica's now going to take over and ask if anyone has any questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Joe. That was great to listen to. I think it's very interesting for the audience. We've invited, hosted by the CBD Secretariat, an audience of biodiversity policymakers, planners, and technical experts. And I think it's really interesting for a lot of people who are working in a very applied environment to get a sense of some of what the cutting edge research areas are. So we've raised some questions on the slide about the relevance to CBD parties and asking whether there's any similar cases in the countries and regions who've signed up for this webinar. We know we had a lot of participation from Latin America in particular, or any ideas about test cases or opportunity, or any views on feasibility or challenges, or basically any other thoughts or questions. So we have a number of people on the line, and what I'm going to suggest is that I'm going to unmute the lines so that we can take questions for Joe. I'll take 2 or 3 questions at a time. I'm going to suggest if you're in a noisy environment with mobiles or cubicle neighbors or children or anything, just if you could please mute yourself if you think there'll be some background noise. So I'll go ahead and unmute the line. And I'll start by taking an initial 2 or 3 questions or comments. I think just while the lines are unmuting, just to mention as well that Joe pointed out that the first case, the Uzbekistan case, is slightly unusual in that there are the land tenure situation of the country is entirely state-owned. Whereas the second case in the United States, it was a mix of private land ownership. So obviously tenure is a big issue in terms of how feasible and what are the main challenges involved in implementing these kind of approaches. So if I can open the floor, do we have any questions? And please just introduce yourself.
Jessica, I could. There's a question that's come up on my chat screen, which I could answer whilst we're waiting for people to put their questions together.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't see that one. Yes, from Sakile. Okay.
Yeah, from Sakile, exactly. So thank you, Sakile, for that point. And I absolutely agree with you that no net loss is not ambitious enough in the face of change. I also agree that we should be aiming for not only preventing the rate of loss, but also restoration of ecosystems. There are 2 things I would respond to that point. One is to say that I've talked a lot in my talk about no net loss, but actually many biodiversity offset policies and mechanisms aim for a net gain. So the offsets actually will aim for a net gain, partly to make sure, because of the various uncertainties involved in calculating and demonstrating what no net loss is, to make sure as far as possible that there is no net loss, but also in certain habitats it's not considered acceptable to aim for a net loss, and a net gain is required. So that's one thing that I would say. The second thing I would say is that biodiversity offsets and really absolutely have to be seen as part of a suite of conservation measures. And the role of biodiversity offsetting is not necessarily to result in net gains for species conservation or habitat conservation. It's to prevent losses from economic development where that economic development is necessary and deemed a requisite for societal development. It's there are other conservation interventions which are necessary, and some of which would be based on some of the ideas I've talked about today, but which would be about restoring ecosystems and ecosystem services. So I think it's important to see offsets as one in a set of conservation mechanisms that together provide what you're talking about, which is a halt of loss and restoration of degraded systems. But obviously, I'm happy to take a follow-up point if you have one, Sakila.
Thank you, Joe. Do you have any other questions or comments from the floor?
Hi.
Hello.
Hi, Sakile.
Hi, Sakila, go ahead.
Okay, so I take it there are no other questions. I can just make a follow-up question, right?
Sure, please go ahead.
Okay, so I appreciate Joe's answer. I think that it makes it clear, especially for policy makers, decision makers at country level, that we should make sure that offsets are part of a suite of options. And I think, as Joe made mention early in his presentation, that there could be a way of raising funds for conservation. My question is, how do we avoid, I think Joe also mentioned this, I guess, how do we avoid it then just becoming the go-to in development? So having worked as an environmental consultant for a short while, you're given the option, when you have to write an environmental impact assessment, you have to give 3 feasible options. The one is we have the project with no mitigation measures. The second one is we have the project with mitigation options, and then the third one is we don't have the project. And always we're going to go in EIAs for the middle option, because we always present we're not going to have the project as not possible. We can't not have this project. This project is absolutely essential for development. And for example, I was involved with dams and stuff, and we were hired to do the EIA for the dam, and we were told no project is not an option. So it's already a given. So how do we, when we talk about offsets, avoid it being the go-to solution for a lot of things at country level, because it does sound enticing. It has a lot of technical thinking behind it, and so you can present it, and it could be acceptable to the environment department that gives permissions for development. So I'm not sure if my question was clear, but I'm worried about abuse of the tool.
Thank you, Sakila. Shall I go ahead and answer that, Jessica?
Sure, go ahead.
So thank you for the points, Sakila, and it was absolutely clear, and I think you're right to raise it as a concern, and it's the concern of many. So I'm based in the UK, and we've been developing an offset policy here for the last few years. When I say we, I mean the government in the UK, not myself. And it's one of the chief concerns people have, is that it will become the go-to option for developers, but also that it will allow development to occur where it wasn't allowed anyway. So it will result in more ecosystems being cleared or being impacted negatively than would have happened without the policy. So it's a valid concern, but I think that's not. I mean, there's 2 issues in your question that I'd like to pull out. One is that you talked about development going ahead, and it will go ahead anyway, and that not having the development is never really an option. And the second one is about how do we assure ourselves that biodiversity offsets don't become the go-to solution, basically. And I think they're actually 2 different two different points there, so I want to make sure we tease them apart. I think any offset policy, really, the ones that I'm familiar with, the ones that are well established around the globe, none of them say if there's a development that wouldn't be allowed to go ahead on ecological grounds because it would have too great an impact upon the species, it's okay if you do an offset. None of them say that. They're very clear about, very adamantly say that that's not what an offset's for. So I think the point about development's going to go ahead anyway is a key one to bear in mind. And really implementing this ideas like biodiversity offsets is a way of dealing with the fact that more often than not, people will allow developments to go ahead almost irrespective of their impacts upon ecosystems. So we need to find a pragmatic way of dealing with that. I actually would slightly disagree with you. I do know of a few examples myself where a development hasn't gone ahead because of ecological impacts. In fact, there's a couple I could quote from the UK. I obviously can't quote them because they're confidential, but they involve, for instance, the deposition of pollutants upon a special area of conservation, and the entire development was actually prevented from going ahead as a result of that. So I think, and that's just one that I pulled out the top of my head from the UK. I think there are a number of examples where development hasn't gone ahead because of ecological impacts, potentially ecological impact. So that's my response to the first part, the first point raised. The second point, which is about preventing offsets being the go-to option. So I haven't really talked about it in this talk, and maybe you're aware of this, Akile, but offsets are always put in place as part of the mitigation hierarchy. So they're never intended to be the first go-to option for mitigation or compensation. They're supposed to come after all other options have been exhausted, which includes avoiding impacts, reducing impacts, and restoring areas that are being cleared during construction and operational parts of a development. So they're seen as a final solution. In terms of how we ensure that they are actually used as a final, as the kind of final option after we've avoided and minimized as many of the impacts as we possibly can, that is a more difficult question, and I can see that that's something I think that offset practitioners and policymakers are still grappling with. But there are case studies where that mitigation hierarchy has been well applied, and you can demonstrate how that's been applied. I would say a couple of the more kind of prominent examples where biodiversity offsetting is being used are, for instance, some of the Rio Tinto sites around the world, and they're obviously not perfect, but what they have done in some instances, for instance, is avoided areas of their concession. They're not planning on extracting those minerals from the ground because of the impact, so that's an avoidance measure. And then there's a whole suite of minimization measures which reduce the overall impacts of the development on biodiversity. And then biodiversity offsetting is seen as a final option after all that's been put in place. So I think to answer that second part of your question, how do we present it being the first go-to option? It's difficult, but if we can ensure that the mitigation hierarchy as part of the planning process or EIA process or whatever is fully robustly implemented and enforced, then I think it's possible to make sure that biodiversity offsets are seen as one of the last options on the table. So I hope that kind of addresses some of your points.
Thank you, Joe. Yes, and barring any other comments from the floor, is just thinking about this from a national policymaker point of view. Some of the tools that national policymakers could use to ensure that offsets are not necessarily the go-to, but are part of a broader strategy would be strategic environmental assessment at a landscape level, or green economy dialogues at different levels, and then just tools for good governance like stakeholder engagement in decisions about land use. So hopefully the countries participating on the call can visualize how offsets would fit into that kind of a landscape. So do we have any other comments or questions? Speaker?
Hi, I do have one.
Go ahead, Veronica.
Hi. Yeah, thanks a lot, Joe, for the talk. It was really interesting. You talked about this example of the Sida antelope and then also of the greater prairie chicken, lesser prairie chicken, but I wanted to get your views on what you see as some of the challenges in implementing these moving conservation targets in marine and coastal areas, do you see the set of challenges being, obviously there are some that are quite different, but I was just wondering if I could get your views on marine versus the terrestrial realm.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question, Veronica. I mean, this is it's an area that I'm very, very interested in. Actually, is how to apply this thinking to marine and coastal areas, particularly marine areas. I think some of the issues are similar. So, and I mentioned towards the start when we talked about drylands being the case studies and having relatively mobile species. That's a similar issue for marine and coastal habitats. Obviously, species in marine environments tend to be quite mobile, move over large distances. So that's a similar issue. I think for me, there's a couple of issues which make it quite interesting in marine environments. One is that I don't think there's been, certainly in comparison to terrestrial environments, there's not some understanding of industry, what industry is kind of driving change and how it's impacting different marine environments. And I think that's something I'm working on with some colleagues at the moment, is understanding what those key industries are and what the drivers are of impacts upon marine environments. I'm talking about marine environments rather than just sea environments rather than coastal environments, really. So getting a better understanding of that. The second issue for me really is about management of those marine ecosystems, because obviously what you tend to have with terrestrial ecosystems is relatively, you'll have a jurisdiction, you'll have some kind of land ownership situation, whether that's state or privately owned or something. You'll have some kind of ownership rights or certainly license rights. You'll have relatively fixed management institutions and so forth. Whereas in the marine environments, obviously it's governed. It's governed by lots of different multilateral often agreements. Different bodies govern different elements of marine ecosystems, and it's just much more messy, basically. And how you kind of set up a scheme whereby you're trading losses in one part of the marine environment for a different part of the marine environment is much more difficult as a result of management and the lack of ownership rights and so forth. So I think for me that's one of the interesting things. Another challenge, I guess a third challenge actually from a marine point of view, is enforcement. And obviously there's in highly remote areas of terrestrial environments, enforcement is difficult, but that's a different scale when you get to kind of remote marine environments. So I think those are three things off the top of my head that I think are very interesting about, sorry, not off the top of my head, the three issues I'm really interested in myself and looking at the moment with various others on bringing these ideas into marine environments, which I think we need to get our head around. But in general, there's been much less research and progress. There's been some, but there's been much less progress and research on how to implement biodiversity offsets in marine environments. Aside from, I would say, in terms of bycatch and involved with commercial fisheries. So there's been a number of relatively controversial suggestions about how to offset impacts upon charismatic species associated with bycatch in commercial fisheries, such as compensating for the impacts upon upon bird species by kind of conserving and eradicating invasive predators from nesting sites and so forth. But I would again say they're quite controversial. They have been talked about and studied and researched. To just quickly mention coastal environments, I would actually separate marine and coastal environments, because I think some of the issues I've raised don't really apply so much in coastal environments. Obviously, at the very least, in coastal environments, you have much clearer kind of management structures in place, because they often tend to belong to a defined jurisdiction, for instance. And in fact, there are a number of offset projects and biodiversity compensation projects where that involve working in coastal and marine environments. So at the moment, for instance, I'm working on the Caspian Sea, which will involve conservation measures for species such as the Caspian seal, which are migratory and highly mobile, but are not actually affected by the project, but actually will be part of the suite of conservation measures proposed to compensate for any impacts from the project. And that actually has very direct parallels to the case study I've talked about in terms of cider antelope. It's just that instead of being a terrestrial environment, it's a coastal marine environment. So Veronica, I'm not sure if hopefully I haven't rambled. I hope I've kind of answered your points, or certainly responded to it. But I'm very glad you mentioned it, because I think this is crucial going forward, is how we look at no net loss and net positive impacts as a result of development in marine environments. I think it's a very important question.
Great, thank you.
Joe, do you mind if I jump in? My name is Daniel Dunn. I work at the Marine Geospatial Ecology Lab at Duke University, and we actually work with the CBD and the CMS on the marine side, and do a lot of work on dynamic management in marine portion of things. And although there's not a lot in the way of biodiversity offset literature for marine environments, the sort of dynamic management side of things is moving forward pretty quickly right now, and there have been a number of papers that have come out in the last few years and that are in the process of coming out this year related to dynamic management, exact same scenarios you're talking about, mobile protected areas, temporary protected areas, that may be of use in contemplating that side of things. They haven't been related to the offset policy per se, but I would say dynamic management is definitely up and coming, and I'd definitely like to talk to you more about this on the marine side and what we're doing with CBD and CMS.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. Thanks for that, and I would be very interested to talk to you about that as well. And actually, I do agree with you. You are clearly you're clearly going to be much more experienced and knowledgeable about that area than I am. But I do agree in terms of the literature on dynamic conservation measures in marine environments. In fact, a lot of the ideas that we took from disparate literature sources in crafting the review, the paper that this is based on, actually comes from marine environments. So a lot of the ideas around mobile protected areas and so forth have been put forth and proposed in marine environments. So I agree with you that that's where a lot of interesting stuff's being done. I am interested to see how we can use mechanisms like offsetting and so forth to really push the creation of protected areas and restoration in marine environments. And yeah, I would be very, very pleased to talk to you more about this.
Great. Well, it's fantastic that we've made this valuable link through the webinar. Do we have any other questions or comments? Okay, we had a number of participants sign up from Latin America, in particular Ecuador. I don't know if we have anyone on the line from Ecuador who wanted to share any thoughts about their interest in this topic. I understand that Ecuador is currently considering an offset policy and whether this topic might be relevant to that. Okay, so we don't seem to have any more questions or comments. I think we're approaching the end of our session in any case. I would like to, first of all, thank the CBD Secretariat for hosting this call and the wider project that I mentioned, which is working on delivering capacity around targets 14, 15, and the programs of work on climate change and dry and subhumid lands biodiversity. To which we've been able to dive into a number of very interesting topics. And all of the work around dynamic management, I think, as we've heard, is quite cutting edge and up and coming. And it's very interesting to think about and look at the feasibility in different contexts. So I'm really grateful to Dr. Joseph Bull for speaking today and to prepare this presentation for an audience of biodiversity policymakers and planners. And thank you also to the Japan Biodiversity Fund for supporting this project. And finally, thank you for everyone who was able to participate in the webinar today. It's great to have this discussion with everyone, and we will post this. We will make arrangements with the CBD Secretariat to post this webinar for those who were unable to attend. And I think that's it. Well, thank you very much, everyone.